story, but first of all, I want to thank you for being here. You don't have to be here. We can ignore the past. We can live in the present. We can dream our own futures. But you are here because you recognize that the past does have things to teach us. You recognize that the lives that were lost, like us, were a part of humanity, and that their lives mattered. We see the Holocaust today through the lens of history. We look back through it. We see the images of the camps, of the destruction, of the death. But of course, it didn't begin that way. It began when ordinary people, with ordinary lives just like us, were going about their lives, going to school, passing their exam, dreaming of university, going on vacation, celebrating their birthdays, just like Eric at 9 years old. And yet something happened in the world at that time which changed that for those people. And we are those people. That is, we are the people with the ordinary lives, who are going about our business, who are dreaming of our future. But if we don't guard against hatred in our world, just like the people who are living in the 1920s and 30s could never have conceived that the Holocaust would happen, unless we protect our future, we can have that past. Let's go back to 1915. It was the First World War. The war to end all wars that never did end all wars. 1915, in the desert of Anatolia, in the Ottoman Empire, what is today Turkey, there was a young man in the German armed forces. Now, he was a pacifist. That meant he didn't want to carry a gun, he didn't want to shoot, but he had to serve his country. And so he went into the medical corps. And when he was in the desert, he noticed that people were being brought into the desert, Armenians. They were starving, they were hungry, they were dying, they were being shot, they were being hanged. And so one day he went out with his camera and he photographed what he could see. Now, cameras were not allowed. And so he was caught with his camera and he was being sent back to Germany because he broke the law. But he took the film from the camera and he put it inside his belt and went back to Germany with the film. And when he got there, he developed the film. He had photographed the Armenian genocide as evidence. Now it's 1923. A young journalist takes a train. He gets on in Moscow and he takes the train all the way to Odessa, the Ukraine. And he writes a journal about what he sees because he thinks that the Soviet Union, which has just come into being a few years earlier, looks very dangerous and could harm humanity. And so he wants to see what's happening. And he writes a novel. And the novel is called 5 Fingers Over You. It was a bestseller. In fact, it was on the bestsellers list in Germany at exactly the same time in 1924 as Hitler's Mein Kampf. One proposing a totalitarian regime, the other opposing the ideas of totalitarian regimes. In 1933, 10 years later, Hitler comes to power, and on the 1st of April, 1933, there was a boycott against Jewish businesses. Nazis stood outside the shops, outside the business, and stopped people coming to buy, stopped people doing business who were Jewish. On that day, journalists sat down and wrote a letter. The letter was to Adolf Hitler. And it said in the letter, what you did to the Jewish people of Germany today, you did to me as a German. And every free-thinking, open-minded German person is going to rise up and stop you. So I say to you in my name, stop. The letter was never published, as you can imagine, and the writer became one of the first inmates of Dachau concentration camp a few days later. Now we come forward to 1991. I was in Israel at the Holocaust Memorial. It's called Yad Vashem. I was there on a training course to learn about the Holocaust. And in our training course, we were learning about a group of people. We call them the righteous among the nations. These are individual people who stood up and risked their own lives to save a Jewish person. There is an award from the State of Israel ambassador that we give called Righteous Among the Nations. It's a state honor, the highest honor that you can receive. The criteria is you have to have saved one Jewish person only, or more, and you have to do it without gaining any money and at risk to your life. 26,500 people have been given that award over 60 years. Every single one of them saved at least one Jewish person, except for one person who never saved a single soul. I was in Jerusalem for that course, and one afternoon I went into the city of Jerusalem and I went to the Armenian Museum. Small museum, and there were pictures on the wall, and I noticed that all the pictures were taken by the same person. I looked at the little labels, A. Wegner, A. Wegner, A. Wegner, all the pictures. So I turned to my colleague who was German and I said to Annabeth, that's not Armin Wegner, is it, that took these photos? She said, oh yeah, that was Armin Wegner. Armin Wegner was the medic in Armenia who took the photos of the Armenian genocide. He was also the novelist that wrote the book to warn the world about the Soviet Union and totalitarian regimes called Five Fingers Over You. He was also the man who said to Hitler, stop, in my name, stop. 3 times, Armin Wegner warned the world. 3 times he put his life at risk. 3 times he spoke about humanity. He did not succeed once. But he was awarded Righteous Among the Nations by the State of Israel, even though he never saved anybody, because he is the only known person in 60 million people who, after that Jewish boycott, said, what you did to the Jews, you did to me, stop. Armin Wegner is a hero of the 20th century that most people have never heard of. He died thinking that he had failed. Today I'm going to talk to you about testimony, how the story is told by those who experienced it. And I end my story about Armin Wegner as the beginning point to tell you about testimony. 10 years ago, I was speaking to a filmmaker who had interviewed survivors of the Armenian genocide. And I said, what gave you the idea to interview these people who experienced genocide? He said, oh, well, I had somebody came to my house in Los Angeles. He was a German guy, and he said to me, you're a filmmaker, use your camera, record history. It's so important. I said, who was that? He said, oh, you won't have ever heard of him. I said, who? He said his name was Armin Wegner. Armin Wegner, and I said to him, you didn't have the presence of mind, did you, to interview him? And he said, yes, he was my first interviewee. And so today, the Shoah Foundation, which is the organization I run, has the story of Armin Wegner, told by Armin Wegner in 1966 to a filmmaker in Los Angeles. So let's talk a little bit about testimony and how we can use the story of the past to influence our future. First of all, a little story about how the Shoah Foundation was started. Filmmaker Steven Spielberg is well known for E.T., for Jurassic Park, and this year he's filming West Side Story, but in 1993 he made a film called Schindler's List. This is Mr. Spielberg with Liam Neeson at the camp of Auschwitz, and today we're commemorating Auschwitz and liberation. On the film set that day, a survivor came to him, and he was talking to her about the dogs and the trains and the set and what it looked like, and she said to him, Mr. Spielberg, I don't want to talk to you about the day I arrived here. I had a life before, and I had a life after. I want to tell you my whole story. And that, right there, when this picture was taken, Steven Spielberg decided that he would give the opportunity for every survivor that wanted to tell their story the chance to do so. And so the Shoah Foundation was born. In the last 25 years, we've gone to 65 countries. We have videoed 55,000 people in 44 languages, including Spanish. The people that survived the Holocaust spread all around the world, including here to Mexico City, and there are many people who gave their testimony here in Mexico. But also included in these 55,000 are testimonies of survivors who went through genocides other than the Holocaust, from Armenia and Cambodia in 1975, Rwanda in 1994, in Guatemala in 1982 and 1983, in Nanjing, China in 1938. It's a global archive of testimonies of those that survived genocide. What it tells us is that genocide can happen anywhere, at any time, to anyone. So the lesson there is we all need to be vigilant, because we could become the next victims, we could become the next perpetrators, we could become the next bystanders. But we know this will happen somewhere in the world, which is why everybody needs to be vigilant. Our collection today looks like this, more or less. People from Dario, the man in the middle, is the last surviving person that worked in the gas chambers in Auschwitz 75 years ago. He lives today in Los Angeles. Mr. Salibian in the middle, 102 years old, is Armenian. And the three ladies are from Rwanda, Cambodia, and Guatemala. The mission of the Shoah Foundation is not to collect testimony, but you can see here, it's to develop empathy, understanding and respect. In other words, the testimony we have, the stories we have, are not there because of the story themselves, they are there to help us understand how we should be in the world. If I was to go to this archive and take a look at it, what I do, I put in the name of a place or a person, or so I put in the word Auschwitz here, and you can see there are 13,827 people who talk about Auschwitz. When I click on that, the videos come up. When I click again and choose Spanish, the videos come up again, and I find 268 people who gave their testimony about Auschwitz in Spanish. And when you go home, you can have a look at this. It's called Visual History Archive Online. Visual History Archive Online. And you can find these testimonies and listen to them there. For example, like Vera Witt, who is from Mexico City, from here, who gave her testimony. If we look at a little map, you can see that's where she gave her testimony. What then happens to the testimony is we then take it into our education program. So all of you here, after this session today, can go to your teachers and say, we want to see there's 3.2 million students like you that use these testimonies on a site called Eyewitness. And there are 14 activities in the Spanish language, and there's 330 activities in total. And they include learning about the Holocaust related to also everyday things. So for example, the film Jojo Rabbit, which has been nominated for an Academy Award, has an education program in Eyewitness so that you can learn about the film and what the meaning of the film is, using the testimonies of survivors too. So when you go in there, you can see all these activities. We'll just look at the Spanish ones, and they cover all sorts of activities around Guatemala genocide, about discrimination, about what's we got there? Causes and consequences of silence. For example, Llegada a Auschwitz. So this is about Auschwitz, which we're commemorating today, where the survivors talk about what it was like to arrive there and what the process was. And lo and behold, when I went to this activity, who appeared in the activity? Vera Witt. So her testimony that she gave to the archive then gets used in the things that we can do in school. I'm going to talk to you today about technology and how we can use technology to help us understand the story in new ways. In fact, we're going to see some new technology today. This here is Auschwitz. Auschwitz today. The gentleman in the middle in the blue cap, his name is Max Eisen. Max Eisen was in Auschwitz, in this very place, 75 years ago. You can see from these pictures, we're filming Max today. What you can't see so clearly is that the camera he's standing in front of is a virtual reality camera, which means we are filming Max telling his story in the place that he experienced it, but in a way that later on we can look at Max's story through the goggles that you wear with virtual reality and be there with him. This is another survivor. His name is Pinchas Gutter. We're going to meet Pinchas in a few minutes, in a different way. Now you can see him, he's standing in the camp, in the barracks. This is the very place where Pinchas and his father walked through that door on the right-hand side. And that was the very last place he saw his father. As you can see, we're filming him with a green screen and a virtual reality camera, which is a little unusual, but what we want to be able to do is go back there in the future and hear him telling his story in the place he experienced it, like that. That's exactly the same picture, without the green screen and everything. And now what we can do, we can put virtual reality goggles on, and we can walk through the camp with him and learn about the place that he was. So, some of you might have been to Poland. Many of you may never go to Poland, and if you do, you may never go to this particular concentration camp. But what we're thinking is, how can we use technology to tell the story, and then you can visit this place without leaving your classroom or your home. This is a plan of a concentration camp called Mauthausen. At the end of the Second World War, when the Nazis were losing, they kept moving and moving and moving the victims, the Jewish victims, and this is one of the places where many of them ended up. So you can see here my drawing on the map of lots of little spots. That's because we walked around the camp with this gentleman, Ed Mossberg. He was there in that camp. Now you can see the virtual reality camera. When he was in this camp, he would walk up and down those stairs carrying heavy stones, because this was a stone quarry. Now he comes back as a 90-year-old and he's able to sit on exactly the same stairs and tell the story to me, but now we can see the entire quarry, the whole place that he was working, as we're inside the virtual reality. Then what we can do, we can take all of those testimonies and put them on our mobile devices. So now, if you go to Poland, or Hungary, or France, or Germany, you can use a Shoah Foundation app called iWalk, and you can walk around the streets and discover the testimonies in the places where the people told the story. And you can see them using augmented reality. For those of you who use Pokemon Go, it's a bit like that. You go to the place, you find the survivor, and then you press, and then instead of getting a little Pokemon, now what happens is the survivor tells you their story in that place. But better than Pokemon Go, of course, now you can also do that in your classroom using Google Maps. So in fact, you don't have to go to Poland or Germany or the Ukraine, you can also do it in your classroom. Some of you might have heard a Holocaust survivor speak, and if you haven't, in a few moments, you will when Mr. Borton comes to speak to us. But in future, we know that Holocaust survivors will not be able to come to our schools and our colleges and our universities. And so we developed a technology that allows us to be able to speak with Holocaust survivors in the future. Now they'll be able to tell us their story, and then we can ask them their questions. The reason we developed this is, what we learned from talking to Holocaust survivors is that even though the telling of the story is very important, what's most important is that you, as students, get answers to your questions. I noticed, going to lots of classes where we talked about the Holocaust and genocide, that when the Holocaust survivor finished talking, students almost never put their hand up and said, "Sir, was it the 13th or 14th of December that you got on the train?" What they would ask is, "How did you feel when you lost your mother? Do you hate the perpetrators? Can you forgive the perpetrators? Do you believe in God? Do you have nightmares? What is your message to us about today?" Their questions were not about the history, as important as the history is. They're questions about, what does this mean? But we also don't know what students are going to ask in future. And so with this project, we ask students all around the world to say, what are the things that are on your mind so that survivors can tell us their story? Before I show you this and introduce you to some survivors, I want to tell you how this testimony works. Unlike a normal testimony where we might sit in somebody's house in the comfort of their room for, say, 3 or 4 hours and ask them to tell us their history, for this interview, the Holocaust survivor sits 5 hours every day for 5 days and answers over 1,000 questions about their lives, somewhere between 500 and 1,000, because we don't know what people are going to ask in future. And so when they give us this kind of testimony, they're making a really big sacrifice, because they're not only doing that, but they're also sitting in a studio with a green screen and thousands of lights, and we also film them with 25, 30 cameras, because we film them as holograms, so that in future we'll be able to use the hologram so that the Holocaust survivor will be able to be full size in a hologram in your classrooms. So now I'm going to introduce you to Pinchas Gutter. Now a little warning, technology sometimes works. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
What is your name?
Hello, my name is Pinchas Gutter, and I'll be only too happy to listen to your question.
Pinchas, where were you born?
I was born in Łódź, in Poland.
And how old are you?
I was born in 1932, so you can make your own arithmetic.
Can you tell me about your family?
If you came to my home, you would find my family, who were my mother, and I had a twin sister. You would find my father was a Hasidic Jew, and you would find huge shelves of books, a very large dining room, which was actually more like a lounge than a dining room where a lot of people could come in there, because we always had lots of guests on the Shabbos, and it was always very, you know, kind of very happy place. It was a very happy place.
What was your sister's name?
My sister's name was Shifra Trana, but everybody called her Sabina.
What happened to your sister?
My parents and my sister were murdered in the gas chambers of Majdanek death camp.
And how do you remember your sister?
What I remember about my sister are actually three things. But I can't conjure her up. And it's all to do with her hair. I remember when we were small, and my mother used to plait her hair. She had two little plaits. I would go, rush behind her, and I would pull her, and I would, like, you know, give her a fright. And you know, and I was very happy that I could kind of, you know, scare her. So I remember that. I remember in the Warsaw Ghetto, where vermin and lice were so common you couldn't run away from it. And you had to try and keep clean. And my mother particularly was a very, for her, cleanliness in our little place we had was very important. So my mother wanted to cut my sister's hair, because her hair actually were very long, right to her backside. And she always used to plait it. And my sister wouldn't let her. So what she would do is she would pick up, you could pick up everywhere, lice. And the lice used to lay eggs. And it was like seeing buds in a tree. You know, when buds started coming on a tree, these white buds, this is how lice lay, and every hair had these, and I remember those. And my mother would spend every week or so, she would get nef, which was difficult to get, it was used actually for cooking, in private stoves, and she would wash her hair and kill those, we used to call it in Polish gnidy, you know, these lice eggs, to clean her hair. And this is what I remember. And I remember, of course, the last time when I saw that plait when she was hugging my mother. So those are the three things that I actually remember, but I don't remember her. I remember things of her hair.
What Vinkus didn't tell you there was that Sabina, his sister, was his twin. And so when they arrived at Majdanek concentration camp, they were separated. But maybe because he was taller or something, or looked older, he survived the selection and she didn't. But after she left him, he tells in another story, after she left him and she disappeared, he decided that he had to forget about the fact she existed just to get through each day. The problem is now, in his old age, he has no memory of his sister except for her hair. Which is why he tells this story. Which concentration camps were you in?
I was sent to, actually, I went through 5 concentration camps. The first concentration camp I went to was a camp called Majdanek. This was a death camp and a working camp. In other words, they didn't kill everybody immediately upon arrival. They made selections, and some people were chosen to work as slave laborers, and others were sent straight to the gas chambers. So when we arrived in Majdanek, my parents and my twin sister, they were murdered on the same day that we arrived there, and I was chosen still in the selection. My father told me to say that I'm not 11, that I am 18 years old, and I was chosen still to work as a slave laborer. So I went through 5 concentration camps, and I finished up in Theresienstadt. So I was in a place called Majdanek, then I went to another camp called Skarżysko-Kamienne in Poland, Another one changed to Zelazna, also in Poland. I was sent to Buchenwald in Germany, the concentration camp. From Buchenwald, I was sent to another working camp called Kolditz, also in Germany. And then, towards the end of the war, beginning of April 45, I was sent on a death march to another concentration camp in Czechoslovakia called Theresienstadt, in Czech, Terezin. And I was liberated by the Russian army on the 8th of May.
So let's show you that this is not actually a PowerPoint. We've got a few moments for questions before I go to the next part of my talk. So if anybody's got a question that they would like to ask Pinchas, if you call it out, we can ask it. Anybody have a question for Pinchas? Can't see you very well. So, yes. If you tell me, I'll relate to him. How did you survive? Oh, let me run this side. How did you survive?
To know how to survive in the camp, I didn't have that intellectual ability as a child to be able to tell you that I knew how to do that. It was all done purely by instinct.
Did you have any techniques for surviving?
Unfortunately, from my immediate family, nobody survived. In other words, my parents, my mother, my father, and my sister, my twin sister, they were murdered the same day when we arrived at the death camp and concentration camp Majdanek. But after the war, I found that out of over 150 family members, extended ones, 4 cousins remained alive.
You got that little wrong. Anybody else got a question?
Right here.
You have to shout it.
Did you show my hand?
Yeah, please shout it out loud.
I had a question.
Yeah.
How was the feeling in the, I don't know how to say it in English, but how was the feeling in the canal, sorry.
How was the feeling
How was the feeling in the canal?
in the camp?
Yeah.
What was the feeling like in the camps?
Life in the camp was indescribable because it was living death. And that's the only way I can describe it. Being in a concentration camp or even on a working camp during the Holocaust was living like living death. You were just 1 centimeter from the grave.
Were you afraid in the camps? Ask me that.
Just repeat it.
Were you afraid when you were in the camps?
To be quite honest, I really didn't react to it at all. I was a child. It was something that was happening, and I don't think I had the capacity to be able to quite understand and, kind of work through or, intellectualize it into understanding of what was happening and emotionally respond to it.
That's interesting. He says he couldn't emotionally respond. And that goes to the same point he made a little earlier, but after the fact his sister died, he killed his emotions, and you said, I have to live every day and just not think about what's happening to me. One more question for Pinchas.
Here.
Oh God, we've got a few.
Here. Here.
Right here.
Right here. The other side.
On the other side, where's the camera? Whoever's got the microphone, surely
Here.
Okay, over here.
Yeah, what happened to you after the war?
What happened to you after the war?
There were a lot of discussions about moving away from Łódź.
What happened after liberation?
When we woke up in the morning in Theresienstadt, we heard that the gates were open and that the SS and all the guards had disappeared and that the Russians have arrived. So that's how we knew. And then as soon as I got up, I had enough strength to run out, and I ran out and I saw a very sorry sight of men, old men, women with children, trampling, kids, little, kind of, any kind of little conveyance, cots and children's rigalach, and while they were moving, we learned that these were Germans, and that the Czechs were expelling them because these were people that were settled by Hitler and the Nazi regime in Czechoslovakia, where they made a lot of the area, free of Czechs, and they resettled Germans in that area. And I also noticed them being abused by the Russian soldiers, by other people. They were hit and they were being robbed, and they were hurting. They were suffering, and I felt extremely sorry when I saw these people suffering. I felt sorry. I felt. It didn't even enter my mind that these were Germans, and that I suffered at their hands for 5 years. This infernal sufferings. But when I saw these human beings, regardless that they were Germans, I felt very, very sorry and sympathetic. And when in the evening, we discussed it in Theresienstadt. Some of us, some of the younger people, we talked about it because I told them, and some of them, of course, were completely, uninterested, but quite a few of them felt exactly the same. So I think when you suffer, and you see other people suffering, it is almost, the empathy flows from you.
So it's a little like real life. Sometimes you get a short answer, sometimes you get a very long answer. Sometimes it's on topic, sometimes it's a little off topic. So he knew he was talking about after the war. He didn't quite get the answer because he wasn't sure about, we'd have to ask him specifically, where did you go and so forth to get to your question. So just a little word about artificial intelligence. It's very artificial and not very intelligent. So what you have is a lot of human beings that program it, and eventually it learns. So what happens with this is, the more we use it, the better it becomes. So, schools that are here, I am asking you to volunteer so that your students that are here can join our program of testing. Because we'd love to have this in your schools so you can speak to pen pals and other survivors and help us to improve it so that other students can then get the benefit of the improved artificial intelligence. So if you're volunteering, thank you, I just volunteered you. So I'm going to turn for a moment though to something a little special here. So meet Leah Novero. Leah Novero is the first person that's done this in Spanish. And this is the first time her testimony has been seen anywhere in public. And it's on the internet, so it might be a little slow, but we're going to practice our Spanish a little more right here. Hola.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
¿Cuándo y dónde naciste?
Nací en el pueblo de Mijalovo el 31 de diciembre de 1926.
¿Cuál fue el momento más feliz de tu infancia?
Uno de los momentos más felices para mí era cuando llegaban las vacaciones y las 4 hermanas, de las cuales mi mamá era la mayor, se juntaban con todos los chicos, todas tenían chicos chiquitos, y íbamos de vacaciones a casa de mis abuelos, de mis queridos inolvidables abuelitos maternos, que vivían en ese pequeño pueblito, que era un pueblo para veraneo. Íbamos allá porque mis abuelos tenían una gran casa para todas las familias y allí pasábamos las vacaciones de verano. una familia enorme, todos juntos. Estos eran los momentos más felices de mi infancia.
Adorable. ¿Cuál fue tu primer contacto con un soldado nazi?
Los dos soldados que llegaron con el camión eran nazis, con caras de pobres perros, no los quiero ofender, con caras especiales. Los nazis pasaban por un colegio, por una enseñanza especial, y uno tenía miedo de mirarles la cara. Estaban con las metralletas preparados y uno de ellos, que era el que mandaba, dijo, cuando toda la población ya estaba en la calle, separaron a los hombres aparte y dijeron, bueno, que se presenten los notables. Y allí se presentaron los notables, el rabino, había dos abogados, había dos médicos, había un poeta, un hombre divino, un escritor que también se presentó, eran como 10 personas. Los llevaron a la plaza y en presencia nuestra los ametrallaron. Ahí era el primer encuentro con los nazis. Con una sangre fría los ametrallaron las 10 personas que se presentaron como los notables.
¿En qué campos estuviste?
Estuve en Birkenau, luego los 6 últimos meses Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Malchow, Leipzig.
¿Pensaste que ibas a sobrevivir a la Shoah?
Casi nunca pensé que algún día voy a salir de esa. Uno quería sobrevivir. Por un lado, el instinto de conservación nos empujaba para seguir aguantando lo que aguantábamos, pero yo no tenía esperanza de poder sobrevivir. Y sin embargo, había algunas mujeres que tenían una fe terrible, que sí, que vamos a salir de aquello. Yo era más bien pesimista y sobre todo yo todavía no estaba formada psicológicamente como las mujeres adultas. En muchos aspectos yo tenía miedo y no tenía esperanza.
So we asked Leah over 500 questions about her life, and hopefully if you do help us and do some testing for this, you'll be able to ask her many of those questions to find out more about her life, so that other Spanish-speaking students can use it. I'm going to ask you just one or two very final questions. ¿Qué significa ser un sobreviviente del Holocausto?
Ser una sobreviviente significa de llevar encima una mochila que pesa 10.000 toneladas.
You know, it's sometimes easy to think about the fact it's happened a long time ago and that she's such a lovely woman and has her family and all the things, but the burden of the past, the memories of the past remain with her throughout her life. We're also living in a world today in which anti-Semitism still exists. So we asked her questions about the world in which we live today, including this one. ¿Cómo podemos combatir el antisemitismo en la actualidad?
Hay que tratar de hacerlo constantemente. Y yo pienso que con la palabra y únicamente con la palabra, con la educación, con la paciencia para tener, es muy difícil, es fácil decir con la educación, con la paciencia y todo esto son palabras, meras palabras, pero si empezamos a pensar en todo lo que significa esto, es la única manera, y no es un trabajo de un año ni de 2 años. Esto tiene que empezar por la educación desde abajo. Y siempre llego a la misma conclusión: educando al soberano.
Gracias, Lea.
Igual no se hacían grandes.
Survivors at least with us today. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dolly and Julio Barton, and to ask Julio to come and join us on the stage to talk about his life and these stories. Julio Barton. While Julio is making his way to the stage, let me just tell you a quick story. A few months ago, Julio and Dolly Barton were in Los Angeles, California, and they came to visit the Shoah Foundation, which is at the University of Southern California. So we spent a little time together, maybe 2 hours, at the university. Now, I think it's true to say we never ever get any Greek people coming to the Shoah Foundation on a day-to-day basis. People that come from Greece originally. But Julio and Dolly originally were from Greece, so it was very nice to be able to talk to them about the testimonies that we have in the archive about Greece. Quite surprisingly, while they were sitting there, a gentleman stepped out of the elevator and he said, I'm here at the university with my son. My family is from Greece. My father has survived the Holocaust. Do you have any testimonies about the Greek Holocaust? And I said, it's funny you should say that. Our friends from Mexico were originally from Greece and they're sitting right here. And we had a wonderful conversation in Greek, Spanish and English, in which it turns out that Julio Barton's father was a good friend of this gentleman's father. And so what we learned was that their families had come from exactly the same place and shared the same childhood, the same beach, the same experiences. And it goes back to exactly where I started my talk at the beginning of the day, to say these are just ordinary families living their ordinary lives who had this terrible experience happen to them. What we're going to do over the next few minutes is I'm going to talk to Julio about his life. He doesn't know this yet, but I'm going to ask him exactly the same questions as I asked Leah. And the reason for that is, I want to see how similar his story is to her. Because my experience over many years is, we think about the Holocaust being one thing, but the Holocaust was not the murder of 6 million Jews. It was one after another after another. And every single person had their own individual lives and their own individual stories. So the questions that we ask and the stories that we tell are very different from one person to another. And here he is, Julio Barton. Hola.
Hola. ¿Me oyen?
Sí.
By the way, he speaks like 12 languages, so if he starts speaking in Yiddish or Greek or Spanish or English, or you just have to switch languages. Julio, what a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to ask you.
I'll be speaking Spanish.
Yes, please do.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you.
All I'm asking is that you make your questions in English, and then I give the answers, if I have any, in Spanish.
But I have them in Spanish.
If you have them in Spanish, I'll answer them in Spanish too.
Yeah.
If I understand your Spanish. Because it's more Argentinian.
chapter?
Oh, my chapter was that.
In Spanish.
Todos los días era un día feliz. Venías de una familia de clase media, media alta, con posibilidades económicas, con cuestiones culturales, se leía, se escuchaba música, entonces todos los días eran felices. Y no puedo pensar en un momento particular. Si fuera un niño normal cualquiera, diría mi bar mitzvah, pero es lo que me hace diferente. Yo no pude tener bar mitzvah.
Tell me about your parents.
My parents.
In Spain.
En español. Ya digo, perdón. Pues mis padres eran esos. Mi padre y la familia de mi padre acostumbraban ir a la escuela italiana. Los de mi madre, las chicas iban con las monjas católicas y los muchachos iban a los liceos laicos. También iban a las escuelas de la Alianza Universal, Alianza Israelita Universal, y pues había una vida de cada día. Creíamos que Salónica era muy particular porque era una ciudad básicamente judía y los judíos tenían una libertad absoluta de hacer lo que quieren. Y la vida era buena hasta cuando se empezó a escuchar como niños a los mayores hablando del peligro de Hitler, y que si Kristallnacht, y que si las preocupaciones por perdón, ahí se me va la onda, pero tengo 91 años. Estábamos hablando de los momentos felices, o ya habíamos pasado de esto.
I want you to tell me a little about what happened when things changed when the Nazis came in. How did it
Well, it was, fue una cosa paulatina. Primero en los 30, por ejemplo, lo que marcó mi vida como infancia es el hecho que mis padres tuvieron que retirarme de la escuela italiana donde hacía la primaria porque Italia, bajo el fascismo de Mussolini, empezó a tener algunas leyes antisemíticas. O sea, eso lo recuerdo, que es como una de las primeras cosas que me hacían distinguir como judío. Hasta ahora ser judío quiere decir comer masá en Pesach, o ayunar en Kippur, o recibir un regalo en Hanukkah, o cosas dulces en Purim. Eso es lo que... Por lo demás, teníamos nuestro propio idioma que guardábamos por 5 siglos, que era el judaísmo, malamente llamado ladino ahora, pero que era el judeo español, y que este era el idioma que se hablaba en casa. Y entonces ya vimos que ya hablábamos español, que hablábamos griegos, que era peligroso para los judíos hablar griego porque tenían acento judío, etcétera, etcétera.
¿En qué campos?
Estuve en un solo campo y un año nada más, del cual año los primeros 6 meses fueron muy diferentes a los segundos 6 meses. Este campo era Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen en aquella época, en el año 44, era una especie de
resort comparado con los campos de concentración como eran después. Eran para Sonderfälle, que quiere decir casos particulares, casos diferentes. Y nosotros pertenecíamos a esta categoría porque éramos de un grupo de familias que habían conservado la nacionalidad española. Y como Franco era aliado de los alemanes, no fuimos perseguidos con la brutalidad que fueron perseguidos nuestros demás hermanos. Y además esto nos permitió ser unos lazos de unión en los que de nacionalidad griega tenían que vivir en guetos y los que estábamos fuera del gueto. ¿Y por qué eran dos campos? Por la razón siguiente. Porque el primer grupo de esas familias que habían mantenido la nacionalidad española fue deportada de Salónica directamente a Bergen-Belsen, donde estuvo casi un año, y luego tuvimos noticias que los alemanes los entregaron en la frontera franco-alemana, y ya de allá se fueron a Barcelona y de ahí a otros lugares que no tienen que ver con lo que estamos hablando. Pero el problema, cuando los que estábamos en Atenas teníamos el mismo privilegio como españoles, pero resulta que cuando los italianos se pasaron al campo aliado, los alemanes inmediatamente entraron en Atenas, que era una región en que era una región que no tenía leyes antisemíticas. Y en cuanto entraron los alemanes, con todos los problemas que tenían y pidiendo la guerra, no se les ocurrió que había que dejar tranquilos a los judíos y tratar de ganarla, sino que lo primordial y lo más importante, según el pensamiento, yo digo nazis para endulzar la palabra endulzar y algunos amigos, pero en el fondo pienso y digo los alemanes, y no veo gran diferencia. No estaba dividida. Hitler fue elegido democráticamente, sus actividades locas fueron filmadas, Kristallnacht no tuvo ningún problema. Entonces, ¿cómo nos pueden decir que no sabían lo que pasaba por la dictadura? Pero a pesar de ello, cuando se establecieron las leyes de Nuremberg en la zona de Atenas, fue la misma rutina, etcétera, etcétera. Pero entonces, las autoridades españolas nos dijeron: es tiempo que ustedes se rindan a los alemanes. Ya vieron que el primer grupo pasó 6 meses y ya lo liberaron. Ahora, lo mismo puede ser, y ojalá nosotros, los que estamos aquí en la embajada, pudiéramos hacer lo mismo. Y entonces formamos parte de un grupo que se entregó a los alemanes, porque también los españoles nos decían que una vez que estábamos fuera de la ley, ya no nos podían dar protección, cosa lógica. Entonces, lo que pasó con nuestro grupo, y entonces hizo nuestra vida imposible, fue mes de junio, con la invasión de Normandía, se cortaron las vías ferroviarias entre Alemania y España. Por lo tanto, ya no había forma de que España nos recibiera. In the meantime, en lugar de 3.500 personas que había inicialmente en Bergen-Belsen, y todos eran casos especiales, Bergen-Belsen ya tenía 35.000. Y ahí voy a parar mi relato, porque de ahí, en los últimos 7 o 8 meses, fue cuando nuestra vida de campo fue como la que todos conocemos y que todos han declarado, y no vale la pena repetirlo. Lo importante es ver hacia adelante.